Good afternoon. My name is Dave Miskey, and I'm with the Redevelopment Authority of the City of Milwaukee. RACM is the acronym, so you've probably heard of HACM, the Housing Authority. This is the redevelopment authority that was created in 1958. So the state of Wisconsin decided back in 1958 that it should give cities more power, more powers to help the city function and move things forward. So in 1958, a state law was created that allowed the City of Milwaukee to create the redevelopment authority of the City of Milwaukee. So what are we charged with doing? We're charged with eliminating blight, which the definition of blight varies significantly. Could be anything from a Superfund site, which is the worst of the worst environmental projects, to the Milwaukee Public Schools having asbestos in their schools. So it's, again, Redevelopment Authority's mission is to eliminate blight. It's also to foster and promote job creation and business expansion. So we work an awful lot with businesses, and we also try to facilitate new housing development. So again, the mission is to eliminate blight and slum, to promote business expansion and job creation, and to facilitate housing development. What are some of the ways we can accomplish those things through our mission? One is we prepare and implement comprehensive redevelopment plans. A number of years ago, we had over 300 redevelopment plans on the books. And what that meant was that we had small neighborhood plans for each of these areas that were critical in trying to establish blight, but also in creating ways to eliminate that blight. Many of those have expired. They were created back in the 1970s and 80s. They have since expired, and we have moved on to where we have about 65 of these plans on the books. These differ from land use plans that the planning group in our Department of City Development create, and that, again, these are created to figure out how to remove blight or eliminate blight and how to invest in those neighborhoods. One way to do that is to assemble real estate. So we buy land, we sell land, we do everything with real estate. So we're kind of the real estate arm of the Department of City Development and the City of Milwaukee. We, through state statutes, again, have the ability to borrow money. So we can create bonds. We have the ability to issue bonds. Sometimes the city uses us as the bonding entity. The city has its own bonding authority, obviously, but sometimes RACM, the Redevelopment Authority, will be used to issue bonds and or make loans. One of the ways we provide a financial package for developments is to provide a low-interest loan, which I'll talk about in a little bit regarding environmental work. And the final operation on this slide that we talk about is condemnation. We do have the power to use eminent domain, and that is to further redevelopment objectives. However, the city has been very reluctant to use eminent domain or condemnation powers for a lot of reasons, but primarily because of legal reasons. What else do we do? What other operations do we have in our toolkit? We can also assist displaced families and businesses. So a few years ago, the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District, MMSD, utilized RACM, the Redevelopment Authority staff, to negotiate and purchase houses along the Kinnickinnic River. There were 84 properties that the sewage district had identified as properties being in a floodplain. They used RACM, or the staff of RACM, to negotiate with those property owners to buy them out and do some deconstruction of their houses and businesses and relocate them. So our role, again, was to work with the displaced families and to find homes for those individuals. We also manage housing and economic development projects. So we have projects that are housing, retail-based, and industrial-based. We could create tax incremental districts, which I'll talk about briefly as well. But we are also, part of our operation is to manage those projects and to facilitate their further progress. And the last operational item that I want to touch on is that we manage property and investigate environmental issues, brownfield testing and cleanup. And brownfields, what are they? I think by the group that we have in the audience, we can see that the number of you understand what brownfields are, but the definition, it varies slightly, but really what it is, these properties are abandoned or underutilized properties, and they have contamination, so real contamination or perceived contamination. People think that they're contaminated. They vary in size from small postage stamp sized little gas stations to large industrial properties that historically had a lot of chemicals that were used that were put on the ground or in the groundwater. So they can be anything from a 500-acre auto assembly plant to a small abandoned corner gas station. So how do we deal with these? How does the city of Milwaukee deal with brownfields, and why do we want to do it? Well, first off, we want to increase tax revenue. When you have a brownfield, you have a low tax base. You probably don't have many jobs. You probably have a blighted condition. So the first three items on this slide talk about why the city must take the initiative, and that is, again, to increase tax revenue, create jobs, and to eliminate blight. We also leverage the existing infrastructure. When I say existing infrastructure, we're talking about roads and utilities. That's the difference between using a green field or a farm field, comparing that to a brown field in the city, as we have the roads and utilities already servicing that property. We also are forced to take the initiative sometimes to clean up the environmental issues. Maybe it's a property next to a river. Maybe it's groundwater contamination or soil contamination. So sometimes we're trying to protect human health and the environment. And then the final item of why we, the city, are forced to take the initiative is that it's to revitalize different areas of the city. Remembering those redevelopment plans that I talked about, the 300 or so that used to exist, it's really to implement those plans. It's how do we use our tools to create a revitalized residential, commercial, or industrial area. Now, we look at brownfields in three different ways. There are three different types in the city of Milwaukee. One type is city-owned brownfields. Another are privately owned, where they're mothballed, and the owner of the property is just sitting on the property, not really providing any value to the neighborhood. And the third type is a privately owned, but it's tax delinquent. So we have a number of properties that are tax delinquent brownfields. And I'll talk about each of these categories in a little more detail now. The first is city-owned. So we do own some brownfields, and we own those because we had decided long ago that there are certain properties that we want to take control of and move forward because of their catalytic nature and how we identified them in the redevelopment plans that we had created to make sure that those properties were addressed effectively. So when we control the process, when we do own these brownfields, we look at the cleanup is much cheaper at construction, so not going in and cleaning everything up at the onset, but waiting until a development happens and follows at the same time. There's no point in digging the site up twice, once for the environmental and the second time for the construction side of things. What are some of the negatives? If we do own it, we are hesitant to test because then we become the responsible party. When we're the responsible party, we have to, by state law, investigate and clean up these properties. Another negative is we have to wait for the deal. So we're waiting for private sector involvement to come in and say, I'd like to use this property for whatever purpose, and that we just are waiting for that deal as opposed to a private developer who will take on this deal themselves. And then it also hampers marketability. Sometimes if we own the property, the private sector doesn't look at it as an opportunity. They look at it as, oh, the city's taking care of that, they're going to address these issues. Here are a couple of good examples of where we had a city-owned brownfield and we now have a private development that has occurred. The Sigma Group, this address is 1300 West Canal Street down in the Menominee Valley. It's a former coal yard, so there's a lot of storage of coal on the site. Back in the early 2000s, a company came to us because we owned it. The company was the Sigma Group, which is an environmental engineering firm. They worked with us to test it and clean up the site, and now we have a business down there that has 75 employees with a significant tax base. So again, removing blight, adding taxes, and job creation. A second good example is at 2121 South KK, Kinnick Avenue. It's called the Bayview Commons. This is a property that is the window to Bayview from the 3rd Ward and the 5th Ward, the Harbor District area. So it's a critical catalytic project we did a number of years ago. It was an old dry cleaner. We used federal dollars to test and clean up the property, worked with the condo developer who developed this into many condos where you have residential on the 2nd and 3rd floors and retail on the 1st floor. So again, city-owned. We worked with the private sector to investigate and clean up the property. The second example, again, of types of brownfields are the mothballed properties. What are some of the positives of some of these properties? They are marketable. They're generally more marketable because of where they're located, and the taxes are being paid, so clearly the owner of the property feels that they have some marketability. The negative is we don't control it. We don't own it. We don't have many rights to it. So what are some ways that we can move the project forward or move the development of that site forward? One is we can use cost recovery as a threat. What does that mean? That means we can try to use the state and the federal powers to go in and clean up the property and use cost recover, meaning that if we spend $1 million, we can go after the owner of the property to reimburse the state and federal government for those funds that have been spent. We can use condemnation. As I mentioned earlier, we use eminent domain or condemnation, or at least we have those powers, but we have not used that in a number of years, primarily because of the political challenges with using that, and then also the legal challenges with using condemnation. A good example of a mothballed redevelopment is the Beer Line B. This is Commerce Street down here, just north of downtown. We created a redevelopment plan. At one point, there was a prison that was being proposed by the state of Wisconsin to be placed right on the river at the corner of Pleasant and Commerce Street. Fortunately, the plan said, no, we don't want a prison. The city pushed back on it. We put in some roads and utilities, and now what we have are hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property investment and taxes that have come behind it to redevelop the entire Commerce Street Beer Line B infrastructure, and its location has been fantastic. Another one is the former Esser Paint. Currently, if you were to go out to that site, it's roughly 31st and Galena. You will see Washington Park townhomes being constructed. You'll see buildings coming out of the ground. This is a 15-year project in the making where the owner of the property was sitting on it, paying their taxes, but it was vacant. It was a home for drug trafficking and prostitution and dogfighting. The city got involved. We forced the owner to allow us to foreclose on it, but they ended up contributing $200,000 to the demolition and cleanup of the property. On that particular property, to constitute it being a brownfield, again, it was blighted, but it also had 25 underground storage tanks on this small 1 acre parcel. So these are the types of challenges, environmental challenges you might be faced with a brownfield. But again, a mothball property that's moving successfully forward. The third category, these are tax delinquent brownfields. So remember, city-owned mothball properties, and the final category is tax delinquent properties. These are properties that people don't pay their property taxes on. We have over 150 properties on a list that we call the Do Not Acquire list. That list are properties that were former gas stations and dry cleaners and industrial properties. And the positives is that we can test. We can actually get a right of entry from the owner of the property. We can also we can also go to court and get a warrant, much like the police would do, to get a warrant to go onto the property and test. So we do have the ability to test the property, but we oftentimes don't want to clean up the property because it's still privately owned. If we spend $100,000 cleaning up a property, the owner of the property could pay up their back taxes, and now they have a clean property. So there's a little bit of a dance that we have to take with the property owner on something like that. But the negatives, again, don't want to clean it up just yet. There's really not going to be any redevelopment until the testing is done. And then the final one is that they're usually boarded up or vacant lots. So some tax delinquent brownfield examples. Here's one. This is Julie Kaufman, who some of you probably know. She's a developer in town. She built her primary residence at this location at 602 South 3rd, across from Bradley Tech High School. Used to be an old scrap yard, a little yard, just basically a yard. And so we went in, got a right of entry or a warrant to test the property, found some cleanup dollars, and assisted her with the development of her home and business on the back side of the building. And the other example is 2774 North MLK. This was done by the MLK EDC, the Economic Development Commission. They've done King Drive Commons 1 through 4. It's Welford Sanders' legacy. This was the first foray into it. It was an old dry cleaner that was tested and cleaned up by the city, but it was privately owned, a do not acquire property, bought and purchased by the developer, Welford Sanders and his organization, and put in a mixed-use building. So a very successful development. So the final couple of slides, or a couple of points I want to make. One is, what are some of these common elements of brownfield redevelopment? We want to eliminate uncertainties. So going out and testing so we know what's there is very, very critical, because if we don't know what's there, we're not going to be able to capture that private investment. The relationships or the communication with the state agency and the city agency is critical. So for you out in the audience who are proposing to do projects, developers, know what you've got, eliminate those uncertainties from the site, but also understand and have that communication with the state and the city government officials so that you know where the incentives are, you know where state and city dollars are located, and you can work through that. And then also the common element, last common element is the comprehensive land use and public infrastructure plan. So knowing what those plans are, working with the city on what those plans should be for those neighborhoods. That's really, in a nutshell, what I want to talk about today. It was more of what the redevelopment authority is all about, how we work on removing blight, creating jobs, increasing tax base. But then a large part of what we do is dealing with brownfields and the testing and cleanup of those brownfields. So thank you for attending today, and I look forward to answering any of your questions later on.
Good afternoon. I'm Ken Little, Commercial Corridor Manager for the Department of City Development, and I'm here today to talk about the different business resources, basically in the form of grants that the Commercial Corridor team has to offer for real estate developers and those folk who are wanting to prepare real estate on the commercial corridors for occupancy by small businesses. So we have basically 5 different types of grants, and I'll go over each one of those individually in the slide presentation, but we have signage grants, facade grants, white box, retail investment fund, and foreclosed renovation fund. So the first thing you need to know is that all of our grants are reimbursements. These are 4 basic grants, are reimbursements. And any work that is going to be done on a project should not be started before the application is submitted and approved by our Business Resource Committee. And the applicants are encouraged to consult with the people on our team who are nice and friendly, and they don't have any problems holding people's hands to get them through the process, which we think is a pretty simple process. So starting with the signage grant, first thing is it is available for 50% of eligible cost. The minimum project cost has to meet or exceed $2,000. The maximum grant for the signage program is $2,500. And we have various restrictions, but basically the restriction for signage grants is that no internally lit box signs are eligible. So as you can see, we like channel letter signs, awning signs, monument signs, neon signs, and you can get creative and have your own custom sign and hanging signs. But we don't like internally lit box signs. We don't do grants for those type of signs. So it's just an example of one of the signs that we did on Humboldt and North in the Riverworks area, fixation bicycle shop. And next we have a facade grant program. The facade grants are for doing repairs to the outside of the building, which the signage is for just signs, and the facade is for repairs to the outside of buildings that are located on commercial corridors. Again, 50% of eligible expenses. Minimum project cost is $2,000, and the maximum grant in this category is $5,000 per storefront on a publicly facing street. Eligible expenses include windows, doors, awnings, and major facade alterations. If it's part of a larger project, we might consider some landscaping and lighting as part of facade. Here's a facade grant that we're pretty proud of, the Wellness Commons building. This is what the building looked like before, and here's what the building looks like after. And you can see the various facade improvements that we made to the building that really enhances that street. Next, we have our white box grants. Now, white box grants are for doing repairs to the inside of the building. And just like it says, white box just basically means preparing a vacant commercial space for occupancy by just doing the white box portion of it, basically the walls, the electrical, the plumbing, the things that are just necessary to get it prepared. We don't do tenant improvements. This one is, again, 50% of eligible expenses. It limits to $10 per square foot. So and the maximum grant is $25,000. So in order to get the maximum grant, then the building has to, the square footage of the portion that's being rehabbed has to be at least 2,500 square feet. So it's $10 per square feet. Eligible expenses include ceilings, rough carpentry, drywall, HVAC. And restrictions that it can't be combined with our retail investment fund grant, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And here's an example of a before shot for a white box grant. And even though this is a completed shot, it does not include the fancy lighting and the flowers and so forth and so on that you see in this picture. It's just the basic walls that were built out in this situation. So to get one of these grants, all you have to do is a completed application, a lease or written consent from the owner if you're not the owner of the property, documentation that illustrates what the impact of the project will be. So we'd like to have pictures of what you intend to do with the space. You need to have 2 competitive proposals, and that's with the Signage Grant, the Façade Grant, as well as the White Box Grant. And then we'll conduct a site visit when you're ready to apply. We'll conduct a site visit, take some pictures of the before space, and agree upon what kind of repairs or rehabilitation expenses that will be eligible. One thing that you need to note is that if the property has existing code violations, we do not do grants to take care of code violations, and property taxes must be current in order for the project to move forward, and we'll need a W-9 form. Now, the last of the reimbursable grants is the Retail Investment Fund. And with the Retail Investment Fund, we'll fund up to 20% of eligible expenses, and it's for-profit retail projects in commercial corridors. The applicant can own or lease the property. It's a reimbursement program, and eligible expenses include build-out, architecture, engineering, furniture, fixtures, equipment, and we'll consider some startup inventory. Now, the difference between the Retail Investment Fund, or we call it RIF, and the Signage, Facade, and White Box grants is that this one is tied to job creation. So the project can fund up to $50,000, but it's based on eligible full-time equivalent employees. So in other words, the project must create jobs, and the employee must be on the job for at least 45 days. They must be City of Milwaukee residents to be on that job. And then we'll reimburse up to $5,000 per FTE. So 10 full-time equivalent positions that are created will get you $50,000 for the Retail Investment Fund. And this is just a couple of examples of what we've done with the Retail Investment Fund. So you can see it does include tenant improvements and the build out of the space. And we've created some pretty nice spaces across the City of Milwaukee with this grant program. Now, ineligible properties for any of our programs are those that are tax delinquent, as I said before, those that have code violations. Properties in litigation or condemnation or receivership are not eligible, and property owned by religious groups. And properties on which taxes are being paid but have a nonprofit use and exclusively residential buildings. All of our programs are part of the Commercial Revitalization Fund that the Common Council has created. And the reason why religious groups and nonprofit organizations are not eligible, because these are budget items. They do come from the general budget, and those organizations that don't pay property taxes aren't paying into the general fund, and so that's why they're not eligible. Other ineligible organizations and businesses, again, nonprofit agencies, entities, or businesses, schools, daycares. We've relaxed a little bit on daycare centers. We will look at them on a case-by-case basis, but we don't look at currency exchanges, including check cashing agencies and some non-bank financial retail outlets. Taverns, liquor stores are not eligible. Gun shops, pawn shops are not eligible, and cash for gold businesses are not eligible as well. And the final grant program that we have is the Foreclosed Commercial Property Loan Program. Now, this one is technically not a reimbursement program, but it's actually last-in money to help with the reimbursement or the rehabilitation, I should say, of commercial properties that are purchased from the city through the city's tax foreclosure program. So these are properties that the city now owns that they've taken back through delinquent tax payments by the previous owner. So it must be a for-profit retail project in a commercial corridor. Again, the building must be a commercial city-owned tax foreclosed property. It's the last in money, and the maximum of this grant is $75,000. Now, what do I mean by last in money? If you have a project that is $250,000, the program will fund up to a third of the rehabilitation costs for this property. And with a $250,000 project, you'd have to spend the first $175,000 and then we would put the last $75,000 in. Now, we can do it as a reimbursement, meaning you'd spend all $250,000 of your costs, and then we reimburse the $75,000, or we can disperse our $75,000 directly to the last contractors that you have to pay. That makes it a last in money. And a couple examples of projects that we've done here, which is the Tandem project, which was a city-owned tax foreclosed property that had been vacant for a number of years and was brought back to life with the help of this grant program. And additionally, these are just how you'd access the applications and the guidelines. They're on the city's website. You'd visit milwaukee.gov/DCD and click on Business Toolbox, and all the information is there. We also have a Façade Grant hotline, which is 414-286-8201. And you can leave messages there, and you can also leave messages at facadegrants@milwaukee.gov. And we check those messages on a regular basis, a daily basis, and we'll get back to you with any questions that you might have. These are just some other business resources that most people know about: MEDC, Kiva loans, BizStarts, SBA scores, so forth and so on, where you can get other assistance in maybe doing business plans, maybe getting some additional help and getting a business started up if you need that kind of assistance. And other resources where you can get property data from the city's website. And then there's the planning department, which tells you what the plans are or what the desires are for the city in certain neighborhoods. And finally, the final thoughts is, with all of our projects, we want these to be projects that are going to enhance the commercial corridors throughout the city of Milwaukee. They're not just grant programs for the sake of having grant programs. We're trying to build a better Milwaukee. We're trying to enhance the commercial corridors. So we suggest that people look at a project and look at it from a project basis and use the grants to fill gaps if there be gaps. If there are no gaps, if there's not a real need to help get the project completed, then the grant programs are really not for you. So we want a global view of what the project is, and we'd like to see our grants go in and fill those gaps where funding would not be available elsewhere. And with that, I thank you for listening.
My name is John Miller. I'm a Vice President and Head of Commercial Lending at Milwaukee Economic Development Corporation. I want to thank you for having me here today. MEDC is a non-bank, not-for-profit lending agency. We were started in the early 70s as actually a component of the city of Milwaukee, and then in the 80s were converted to a nonprofit corporate entity. What our game plan is typically is to provide gap financing, so we work with banks or other conventional lenders that are willing to do a portion of a deal, but not necessarily take the full risk of a deal, or in some cases have a borrower commit capital equity that they don't have available. So we try to fill a gap that reduces equity down to as low as 10% and still brings conventional financing to a deal of up to 50%. And we fill as much as 40% then in that project. We also look at deals that are a little bit smaller in the marketplace. Today, we know our bank partners well, and they're not real interested from a profit and a management perspective to do deals as low as $250,000 or less. And so in a lot of those cases, we will take on those deals as a standalone conventional lender or play the role of conventional lender in that capacity. In those cases, we typically try to underwrite a little differently or try to underwrite as consistently as a bank would. But again, we can do it with less equity, typically still a 10% down payment. Our primary focus is on for-profit businesses that are owner-occupants of real estate that they want to invest. We typically are a hard asset lender, so we look at equipment, leasehold improvements, commercial real estate investment. We do also provide some investment money for mixed-use properties if there is a commercial component, whether that's a storefront, retail, maybe an office, a small office, or even in some cases maybe a bakery or food manufacturing type of business on the ground level and rental properties up above. But again, for-profit, owner-operated businesses. We will lend to a self-controlled real estate entity, so many people that want to buy commercial real estate will do so with one entity. and then lease it back to their operating company just to separate a little bit of liability risk and a little bit of financial management controls. We have a heavy interest in supporting manufacturing businesses, and that's a wide variety. Again, could be micro manufacturing, very small items, small components. It could be heavy industry manufacturing. It could be food and beverage manufacturing. So we try to cover the gamut, but we also provide financing to service businesses and to retail, restaurants, storefronts, other things of that nature. We provide flexible but fixed rate financing. Again, location within the city, nature of the project may sometimes have an impact on reducing interest rate, but we will fix that rate for the term of our loan. And typically, we will match our conventional lending partner if they're providing what we call balloon financing, a 5-year term with a 20-year amortization. Again, we'll match that structure and we'll set our rate fixed for that first 5-year window, let's say. Our primary target has been historically the city of Milwaukee. While we continue to have high focus on the city, we also do now support some transactions within Milwaukee County. And more recently, we were able to take over some management of funds that support Waukesha County investments. So we are branching out a little bit in the areas that we do cover geographically. Again, talked a little bit about owner occupancy. We look for at least 50% of owner occupancy within a commercial real estate investment. So a commercial building, a larger format commercial building, could be occupied in part by the primary operating company that's borrowing the money for that purchase, but could also have some tenants to help offset the rental income. And again, if it's a mixed use, typically we look for the ground floor to be fully occupied by the business, and the upstairs, if it's residential, can be rented to any third-party tenants that are suitable. What do we finance? We finance the acquisition of buildings. We do additions and remodeling to those buildings, other improvements to those properties, furniture and fixtures that go into office space, machinery and equipment. And again, that can be a wide variety of whatever the business needs. It depends on the nature of the business. And we do provide some long-term working capital. Long-term working capital typically in these cases would be associated with the cost to install, deliver and install some of the equipment that is financed. Sometimes there's training hours that need to go into installing new manufacturing equipment. And we try to provide some support by amortizing that over a longer period of time, rather than put it on a short-term line of credit and have higher expectation for faster repayment. Dealing with acre, we know this is a development crowd largely driven to become investment real estate owners. We're not typically the best resource for that, but we do have some exceptions for where we might be able to play a role. Typically, we can provide some short-term tenant improvement financing. You've purchased a building, you've made some general improvements, you've created white box spaces for your tenants, and they show up with a good business plan, a willingness to sign a lease, but they need help paying for their finished improvements to their space to get it the way they want it before their business would occupy. And you're not in a position as the owner to want or need to make that investment for them because you won't recoup it in rents fast enough. A lot of times we're a good resource to do those TI improvements for your tenant directly instead of adding it onto your financing for the building. The other thing we do is construction gap financing. So again, think of a 504, an SBA 504 structure, 50% bank financing, 40% SBA bond, and 10% equity. The problem you have with that structure often is that the SBA bond can't be funded until the building is completely built out and ready for occupancy, and actually typically won't be funded until after you've moved in as an operating company and have the ability to demonstrate that your business is stabilized. Typically, we can come in those cases and finance up to that full 40% gap. Other cases where gap might exist is simply an appraised value. You have a good project, a viable tenant, a development in an area of the city we want to see investment in. but the appraisal doesn't come in equal to or greater to the cost of the project, we may be able to step in and provide some of that gap coverage without requiring you as the owner or developer to come in with additional equity. So again, trying to foster neighborhood improvement, neighborhood investment, primarily through the investment in assets of real estate, but also, again, supporting business needs from equipment, furniture fixtures, tenant improvements, other steps like that. So that's MEDC in a nutshell. Be happy to follow up with any of you at any point if you have inquiry or need for additional information. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Larry Kilmer, and I'm the Director for the Neighborhood Improvement Development Corporation with the City of Milwaukee. I'm excited to announce that we're relaunching the Rental Rehabilitation Program expansion. And the program expansion is for landlords looking to purchase city-owned properties that are 1 to 4 units. And usually those units have at least 2 bedrooms per unit. We're able to provide assistance for up to $14,999 per unit. And that's in the form of a forgivable loan, which is then matched by the buyer to the same dollar amount per unit or more. Technical assistance is provided by the city's Neighborhood Improvement Development Corporation in assisting with developing scopes of work, bidding on projects, and processing payments for contractors. Properties need to be rehabbed to standard code compliance, as well as lead-safe practices. And there's a number of other programmatic pieces that we would want to make sure that the scope of work includes. Tenants need to be qualified on an income basis, and the units have to be rented out only to a certain level. There's a cap on the rental that can be charged per unit. We'd want you to submit your application after you've received your accepted offer to purchase from City Real Estate, but prior to closing on the property with City Real Estate. So what you'll do is you'll submit your offer, you'll get it accepted by City Real Estate, then you'll take our application, submit it to us, we'll review it, and then once you receive a commitment letter from us, then you're able to close with City Real Estate on the actual transaction of the property. We do require that you have the DNS landlord training certification prior to closing on the project. We would like to have experienced landlords applying for the program. So in doing so, we would consider experience even one rental property that you've had that you've successfully operated, owned, and managed. We do look at this program as a great entry into kind of a career in the development world. So even though we do ask for experience, we do allow for that experience to be in just a small number of units, even one prior rental that you're operating or you've operated in the past. You can find more information on the program at milwaukee.gov/NIDC, as well as calling our main number is 414-286-5810. Thank you.